Prince Sultan was supposed to sit behind the war, not inside it. Then 5 US refueling planes were struck and damaged on the ground there, and that should have set off alarms everywhere, because when the aircraft that keep the campaign fueled are getting hit on the pavement, the problem is no longer out at the edge of the battlefield, the problem is already inside the base. And then came the second hit, the one that turns damage into a warning nobody can soften. Verified photos from the same base showed an E-3 Sentry that appeared to have been split in two, which means this was not just a return strike. It was a return strike aimed higher up the food chain at the aircraft that sees the fight and helps run it. And this did not happen at some empty backup strip in the desert. Before those strikes, Prince Sultan had been visibly packed with 13 Boeing KC-135 Stratotankers and 6 Boeing E-3 Sentry aircraft, which is exactly why this title hits so hard. First, the same base loses part of its refueling backbone, then the same base produces a shattered AWACS, and suddenly Hit Twice stops sounding like a headline and starts sounding like a method. If you want wars explained the way governments don't explain them, subscribe now and tell me in the comments whether you think Prince Sultan was unlucky or whether Iran found a seam in the US air war and came back to cut it open. Here's the question that should be sitting in your head before we go any further. Did Iran just land 2 painful strikes on one base, or did it prove that the architecture behind American air power in the Gulf can be found, fixed, and hit in sequence? Because if the answer is the second one, then the real damage was not only to metal, it was to the idea that the rear of this war is still a rear. The reason the story matters so much is that Prince Sultan had already been publicly named as a target before the worst imagery surfaced. A Saudi military spokesman said a ballistic missile launched toward Prince Sultan Air Base had been intercepted and destroyed, which means the threat was already known, the base was already being tested, and the danger was already real before anyone saw an E-3 torn apart on the ground. That one fact changes the tone of everything that follows. Once a base has already been openly targeted, the next successful hit does not look like surprise anymore. It looks like warning ignored, or warning absorbed without the kind of adaptation that would have made a second penetration harder, and that is where the title's violence really sits. Prince Sultan Hit Twice is not powerful because 2 is a dramatic number. It is powerful because the second hit tells you the first one did not close the opening. It revealed it. Nobody needs to be told why the first strike mattered if they understand what tankers do. Fighters grab the attention. Bombers grab the headlines. But refueling aircraft decide how long everything else stays. Lethal, how far it can reach, and how hard the tempo can be pushed. Hit the tankers on the ground and you are not just damaging aircraft. You are tampering with endurance, range, and flexibility all at once. That is why the first wave already carried more strategic weight than the public language wanted to admit. Because the question was never just, were they destroyed? The real question was, did Iran prove it could touch the support machinery on protected ground? Once that answer became yes, the rest of the war had to be read differently. By the time the latest strike landed, Prince Sultan had already come under attack twice earlier that same week. That is what turns this from an incident into a pattern, because repeat targeting means someone believes the base remains vulnerable enough to revisit. And once the same base keeps getting revisited, every claim of safety starts sounding like a delay, not a defense. This is the point where a lot of reporting gets stuck in the weeds and loses the audience. So strip it down. First the base is threatened, then aircraft on the ground. They are hit, war, then the base is hit again. Then one of the most important aircraft in the entire regional fight is found broken open on the same site. That is not clutter. That is a sequence. And the sequence matters more than any single damage estimate, because one successful strike can be luck, timing, or one bad day. 2 successful entries against the same operational hub start looking like knowledge. They start looking like someone has worked out where the concentration is, what matters there, and how often it is worth coming back. That is why the later images hit like a hammer. The wrecked E-3 was described with its tail broken off and its rotating radar dome on the ground, which means the second blow did not just return to Prince Sultan. It reached into a platform that exists to see the battle space, manage the picture, and help coordinate what happens next. That is not superficial damage. That is a strike against awareness itself. And once you say that out loud, the story gets darker, because the second hit did not just show that Prince Sultan could be reached, it showed that the target set was climbing. First, fuel and persistence. Then radar and command. First the aircraft that let the war keep breathing. Then the aircraft that helps the war keep seeing. That is why audiences click on titles like this. Not just for the wreckage. They click because they can feel that something underneath the official version is being exposed. And what is being exposed here is the structure of vulnerability, not just the spectacle of damage. One specialist looked at the visible destruction. The language got even harder to hide behind. The damage was judged severe enough that the aircraft was likely unrepairable. And that matters because it blows straight through the comfort word that usually shows up first in war coverage. Damaged, at a certain level of ruin. Damaged is no longer a description. It is a public relations cushion. And that cushion is not accidental. Governments do this when they need time to assess, time to relocate, time to control alliance panic, time to avoid giving the attacker a propaganda trophy with your own voice. But viewers are not stupid. Once they hear damaged and then see a command aircraft looking like it has been ripped apart on the tarmac, they know the battlefield has moved ahead of the wording. That gap between language and evidence is where retention lives in a story like this. Because the audience is not only asking what happened, they are asking what is being softened, what is being deferred, and what the polished version is trying not to admit too early. An E-3 Sentry is not just a radar disc glued onto an old airframe. It is an airborne warning and control system with integrated command and control battle management, which means it helps build the air picture, manage the flow, and make scattered aircraft operate like one connected force. So when one of these ends up broken at Prince Sultan, the effect is not confined to one tail number. It reaches into every mission that depended on that flying command post. That is what makes the title so clickable right now. The average viewer already knows a jet being hit is bad. What they came here to feel is something more unsettling than that. That support aircraft, the boring-looking ones that most casual coverage never explains, may be the actual choke points of this phase of the war. And if that is true, then the first strike and the second strike do not just belong in the same video, they belong in the same sentence. The base was hit where it fuels power, then it was hit where it organizes power. That is a much nastier story than aircraft damaged. The location lock matters because it kills the easiest escape route. The photos of the wrecked E-3 were independently confirmed as having been taken at Prince Sultan, which means this is not recycled imagery, not a wrong caption, and not social media fog. The aircraft, the damage, and the place all hold up together, and once they do, denial loses its safest hiding place. Now the person moves somewhere else. Not did this happen, but what does it mean that it happened there? And that is where the story stops being about whether the public has enough proof and starts being about whether the public is being prepared for the implications. Those implications are ugly for everyone involved. For Washington, it suggests the support architecture of the air war can be pressured from the rear. For Riyadh, it suggests Saudi soil is not merely neighboring the fight, but carrying pieces of it. For Tehran, it offers proof that it does not need to dominate the sky to injure the system that dominates the sky. That is why the Saudi silence matters so much. But days after a strike on a Saudi airbase injured 12 American troops, the Saudi government still had not acknowledged the attack, and silence at that level is not an empty detail. It tells you how politically radioactive it is to publicly confirm that a base on Saudi soil used by US forces is taking this kind of pressure in a war Riyadh does not want to look fully fused into. Silence is a strategy here. Say too much and you confirm vulnerability. Say too little and you hope the story stays inside military channels and foreign reporting long enough to buy diplomatic room. But silence also has a cost, because when the public can already see the wreckage and hear about the wounded, the refusal to speak starts looking less like caution and more like concealment. That is where the viewer's distrust locks in, not because the silence proves some giant secret operation, and because it proves something simpler and more believable. The political story and the battlefield story are no longer moving at the same speed, and this is the line that takes the story beyond one base and turns it into something much more serious. Iran is gradually eating away at the network of early warning systems the United States built over decades in the region, which means Prince Sultan may not be the whole story at all. It may be one visible wound in a broader effort to shave away radar, awareness, timing, and confidence piece by piece. Once you hear that, the logic of the target set starts coming into focus. You stop asking why Iran would bother with tankers and AWSs instead of chasing more glamorous targets. Of course it would bother. Those aircraft are force multipliers, and weaker powers live off attacking the force multipliers of stronger ones. That is the deep layer to most mainstream coverage barely touches. Iran does not need to beat the United States symmetrically to make this war more expensive, slower, blinder, and more politically dangerous. It only needs to keep damaging the parts of the machine that make everything else work together. That is why the sharpest reading of these strikes is not random retaliation but a counter-air campaign adapted to what Iran can actually do. The target list itself gives the game away. Radars that detect threats, tankers that keep jets flying, and AWS that directs the battle. First fuel, then vision, then command. The coherence of that pattern is what makes the damage strategically dangerous. And once the pattern is coherent, the pressure on the viewer should go up, not down. Because now the question is no longer whether these strikes were real enough. The question is how many more times a base like Prince Sultan can absorb this kind of pressure before the whole operating concept around it starts to change. That is where AVD gets won in a story like this. Every few minutes, the audience has to feel the blast radius widen. First, they think they are watching two strikes. Then they realize they are watching a support hub being repeatedly penetrated. Then they realize the penetrations fit a logic. Then they realize the logic points past Prince Sultan to the survivability of the wider Gulf basing model. And before any of the AWS's imagery turned into a social media shockwave, Prince Sultan had already become a place where Americans bled. Army Sergeant Benjamin N. Pennington of 26 died after being wounded in a March 1st attack on that same base, which means this was never just a sterile logistics story. The base had already crossed from staging area into casualty site. That human fact pulls the whole story back into focus. It stops this from becoming a cold inventory of damaged platforms and shattered hardware. Because once a base has already taken enough punishment to kill, and still later becomes the site of repeated aircraft damage, including a wrecked E-3, nobody should keep talking about it as if it sits behind the war. It is part of the war's active surface now, and that matters for the close, because a story like this only lands if it answers the big question, without hiding behind one disputed detail. So here it is. Iran spokesman claimed the latest strike destroyed one refueling aircraft and damaged 3 more, badly enough to put them out of service. That exact claim is still contested, and it should stay contested until stronger independent proof closes the gap. But even if we strip away the strongest Iranian wording, the deeper conclusion does not collapse with it. If Iran is fully right, then Prince Sultan proves Tehran can repeatedly reach and degrade the fuel and radar backbone of the US air campaign from Saudi territory. If Iran is overstating its score, the harder truth still survives. The same base was threatened, repeatedly targeted, saw refueling aircraft hit, saw US troops wounded, and produced verified imagery of an E-3 in catastrophic ruin. Either way, the title lands Prince Sultan was hit twice in the only sense that really matters here. Twice in ways that exposed the same base as part of the war's support nerve system. And twice in ways that made the second blow feel less like surprise than confirmation. The real revelation was not that one aircraft broke. It was that a sanctuary broke with it. Stay here, because this channel tracks the wars that officials sanitize and the battlefield keeps exposing